Hello everyone, it's time once again for another lecture on pronunciation. We are still in chapter 4 and we are working on page 42. A lot of times the book gives you a helpful hint in a box here. And it's very good to read those helpful hints and to even try them out, because when you want to sound more native-like, or you're trying to really understand the rapid speech of a native speaker, it may be because of the rules that you see that follow in these helpful hint boxes. So we are looking at verb endings that end in ed, and we have different pronunciation rules, as you'll see. One of the things that speakers do is, depending on the word that comes next after we give that ed ending to our verb, the next word that comes will determine how we say those two words together, which gives us an easier way of speaking. It's more efficient. We don't pronounce every single letter in a word, as you are starting to understand. Okay? So here's a couple of rules to keep in mind. When you want to have natural, smooth speech, take a look at this rule here. Rule number 1. When the next word begins with a vowel sound, A, E, I, O, U, something like that, the ed ending is clear and easy to hear. So the ed right before that next word that begins with a vowel is going to be clearer. Okay, so here we have this example. We phoned in our order. Now, that O there is the vowel sound of the next word. Or sorry, here, the I in the N sound is the next vowel we hear. So N starts with the vowel I, right? So the ed that comes before is going to be heard. It's a lot more clear. So we phoned in our order, phoned in. So we're going to carry that D so you can still hear it, okay? And then we're going to link it to the IN, so it sounds like we phoned in, not we phoned in our order, we say phoned in. So we're going to take that D and we're going to link it to that vowel. So it actually becomes a word of its own. It doesn't mean anything, din, but the listener understands that it's actually a phrasal verb. That means phoned in. That means we called on the phone. And in an idiomatic expression, especially in American English, we say, oh, I phoned it in. That means I called ahead. Okay, you phoned in the pizza order. All right, so rule number 2 is when the next word begins with a consonant sound, the ed ending is sometimes hard to hear, especially if it's voiceless. So if you remember here, how do we say worked? We don't say worked, right? Why don't we say worked? Because the K sound is voiceless. K. So when we have a verb here that ends with a voiceless consonant, k, and we add ed, we're going to keep the voiceless sound because it's just easier for us to speak that way. So instead of saying worked, we say worked. He worked yesterday. I worked on the phone. Okay, worked. But when we're about to say another consonant right after that t sound, that voiceless sound, often that voicelessness actually becomes very low, almost to the point that you don't hear it and it's not there. And we just almost delete it. So we can go right to the next consonant. Okay? So it worked just fine. Notice that you don't hear that T sound. Now, if I force myself to say it, it sounds a little unnatural. All right? It worked just fine. And I can say it that way and everyone will clearly understand me. But in casual speech, we don't have time for that, right? So often the voiceless consonant and the word that gets the ed, okay, we're going to minimize it or just get rid of that voiceless ed ending. So it worked just fine becomes it worked just fine. It worked just fine. And you don't even hear the ed ending. Okay. Now you say, well, what's the difference between the past and the present? Because if that was present, we would definitely say it works just fine. It works just fine. but it worked just fine. The native speaker knows that it's an ED even though they don't hear it, which is kind of funny. So you just kind of have to practice, 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 listen, 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 and it will come available to you. It'll become more natural to you. All right, so just make sure that you understand that. Now let's go to the next page and let's look at Rule 4-2, which is another important rule about the past tense ending. So let's take a look. So this is page 43 in your book, well said. And it says we use ed endings primarily on regular verbs. The ed ending affects meaning, okay? So the ed means something's past generally, all right? So it wants you to look at the rhythm here, the syllables. They watch a lot of old movies. They watched a lot of old movies. On that one, we have that ed, most ed endings are sounds, but sometimes those ed endings are actually syllables on their own. So let's take a look. Here's close, close, closed. Look, looked. But now there are some verbs that have, when you add the ed ending, becomes a syllable on their own. Wait, waited, end, ended. Okay, because there's going to be a special rule for that. So let's look at what our ed ending, because you've already learned the s endings. Let's look at the ed endings. All right. They work hard. They work hard. Okay? They worked hard. They worked hard. Same. But what do you hear? They worked hard. They worked hard. So what do you hear? So hopefully you would say you heard t, okay? T. As in they worked hard. What do you hear on the second one here? The labs closed at 8. The labs closed at 8. Okay? Let's listen to the ed ending on it. The labs closed at 8. Same rhythm. You didn't add a syllable here, but you did hear a different sound. You didn't hear the lab closed at 8. We heard the labs closed at 8. So what sound did you hear? You should have heard duh, right? The labs closed at 8. And then we have another ed ending. I wait for the bus. I waited for the bus. And you'll notice that that does not have the same rhythm, okay? So now when we add this ed ending, we have an extra syllable. So what do you hear? I waited, id. So probably what you're hearing is the id like this. I waited for the bus. Or you do the schwa ending. What you probably heard is the ud. So I'll put that. I have to use phonetic transcription, so let me go to where I need to go. So I just wanted to show you, I kind of went over to our IPA so I could put this in actually phonetic. So we have a couple of ways that we hear waited or waited. So that's the waited with the schwa and the duh. So you either hear this or waited, where you have the I and the D. Okay. So technically, we have either these two sounds. But what's the rule? What's the rule that we have on this? So let's go ahead and see if we can find out what that rule is. Okay, let's go see. So what do we notice here? And before we read the rules, let's see. This work ends in a K sound, which is voiceless. K. And this verb ends in a Z sound, close. So that's voiced. That's voiced. It has a Z. But this sound ends in a T. T. Okay? So it's voiceless, but it's a special one. It's actually where it hits on the roof of your mouth. Now the k was in the back, k, but the t is actually closer to the front of your mouth. And for a native speaker, we change the way we pronounce something because it's a little bit easier. And let's take a look why. Let's come down to our rules. In verbs that end in a voiceless sound, k, we add a voiceless t. Okay? In verbs that end in a voiced sound, we end with a voiced d, closed, right? But here's the weird rule. If the verb ends in a T or a D, okay, that's where your tongue hits the roof of your mouth, right at that ridgy part, okay? Ch, d. If it ends in either, and it doesn't have to be voiceless, that's what I want you to see. It has to be either a T or a D. And if we add ed to that particular verb, then we're going to add an extra syllable. We're going to add an extra vowel to it. We're going to say ud or id, okay? So wait ends in a T, and even though it's voiceless, it's a T. So we say waited, added for the D. But any other of our voiceless sounds, k, all right, p, f, those voiceless sounds will have a T sound. But any of our voice sounds are going to have a D sound unless it's a T or D, all right? So you can go ahead and do exercise 8 on your own, and here, do you hear a 1 or 2 syllables? Add, added, why? It ends in a D. Count, counted. Decide ends in a D. Decided. Expect ends in a T. Expected. Okay, so all of those words there ended in a T or a D, so you have an extra syllable. So these should all be 2s, right? Here we have a voiceless s. So let's add ed to it. So guess becomes guest. 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 I'm sorry, it wasn't guest. It's guess. Guest. It ends in a T. So I guess you should go to the movie. I guessed he should go to the movie. I had guessed that. So even though you see a D, you don't pronounce it if it ends with a voiceless sound. Guess, guessed. Guess, guessed. So make sure that ends in a T sound. And I'm exaggerating a little bit so you can hear it, so my mic will pick it up. You know, I had guessed he'd be here. See how fast that sounds. But I'm actually saying you'll either hear the T or I'll delete it based on what the next word is. All right, check becomes checked. I checked into the hotel. I checked into the hotel. Okay. Laugh, that's that f sound. Laughed, laughed. Finish, finished, finished, finished. So we still have that t sound. And then the final, where we add the D is anything that's voiced. Anything that's voiced, unless it's a D. Okay, so cause, z becomes caused. Save becomes saved. Explain becomes explained. Assume becomes assumed. Realize becomes realized. So we have the same sound. Now there is a note down here. And so if you see a violation of what you just learned, it's probably because of the exception, which means that it doesn't follow the normal pattern, okay? So you add the syllable ud or id to a group of old-fashioned adjectives ending in ed, okay? Now, old-fashioned means that they came into our vocabulary a long time ago. So in naked, that's an adjective. He was naked. The woman was wicked. So even see that these end in the ed because they're an adjective. Crook becomes crooked. Wretch becomes wretched. Rag becomes ragged. Rug becomes rugged. Learned becomes learned, believe it or not. But in English, British English, sometimes they'll say learnt, but learned, and you will hear us say that a lot. Instead of learned, He was a learned person. We would say he's a learned person. Blessed becomes blessed. Now again, we're talking about adjectives, not the verb form of this. So if some religions have a word, blessed be he who, blessed be he who does something. It's kind of like the Beatitudes, where it's a blessed person. So we say, blessed are those who. Okay, so it's like they said, it's old-fashioned, so some of it has a religious basis. Age becomes aged. So add the syllable id or ud to adverbs ending to ed, ly. Okay, suppose, supposed, supposedly. Allege, alleged, allegedly. So advise, advised, advisedly. Okay, so they want you to give advisedly, advisedly. Because usually it would be I advised him, but when you're going to add that ly, it's advisedly. Alleged is usually a D, but if you want to add that ly, it becomes allegedly. Suppose, supposedly. Because usually we would just say, I supposed he would be there, but if I'm going to add ly, he was supposedly supposed to be here. He supposedly arrived on time. All right, so weird rules of English, but it is a matter of the way that we want to bring about an emphasis or sometimes just an easier way to pronounce something. Okay, let's move to the third part of this lecture, to the next page over. Now, of course, you want to practice all of these things in your book. I don't assign every single activity that's in the book. I leave that up to you and your motivation on how much you actually want to improve your pronunciation. But this is one activity that we are going to do, and we're going to do it as a discussion. What's going to happen is kind of a fun thing, and I've actually done this with some of my students, and what we call an icebreaker, get to know you, when I've taught face-to-face in a regular format class. So what this activity is you're going to go onto the discussion board and record yourself saying 3 sentences. 2 of your sentences need to be true about yourself, and 1 sentence has to be untrue. We call that a falsehood or a tale. A tale is a story that doesn't really have much fact to it and any truth to it. We often call that a tall tale, meaning, it's an interesting story, but there's probably no truth to it. Okay? 2 truths and 1 tale. Well, we actually call that a lie, but a tale is kind of a fun thing. We're doing it out of fun. We're not doing it to really deceive you in a bad or, well, I'll put a big word at you, nefarious way, and in a way that is meant to hurt or harm. Okay? So let's take a look at the past tense verbs that we want you to use. And we want you to use at least 3 different ones. 1 each sentence, 1 or 2 for each sentence if you can. Okay? So you make a statement about yourself. It can be more than 1 sentence on your truths, but if you want to keep it to 1 sentence, that's fine. The recording should be very short. All right? So let me use myself as an example. Now, you guys already know me if you watched my recording, but I'm going to tell you a couple of things. Let's say I said, I'm going to write 3 statements, or I'm going to say them, and let me see if you catch them. Well, I'm using an irregular verb, so let me think of a regular verb so we can get these ed endings so we can get their pronunciation right. Okay, so I'm going to say 3 things about me. 1's not true, but they're all in the past. Now, you guys can use these verbs here, but if none of these verbs are working for you, you can go ahead and use a past tense verb as long as it has an ed ending, okay? So as long as it's ed and we're practicing that, you can use verbs that are outside of this chart right here. And I had to do that. Okay, statement 1. I'm not going to tell you if it's true or false. I piloted a plane in the Central Valley, California. I piloted piloted a plane. So piloted means I flew the plane, but because flew is an irregular verb, I couldn't use it. I couldn't say I flied the plane, because past tense of fly is flew. Okay, so I have to say pilot. I piloted a plane. So I have chased criminals through a field before. Chased criminals through a field before. And I have raised 2 sons, 2 children. I have raised, parented 2 children. Okay? So let me write out statement number 1. Well, it doesn't need to be capitalized, does it? Oh, it's going to do it anyway. So the focus I am is I have piloted. Okay. And then down here in statement number 2, I said that I have chased and the last one is I said I have raised 2 sons. Okay, so I'm doing the exercise. I made 3 statements, and I'm going to post those onto the discussion area for this week, okay? And then your classmates, you're going to choose a couple, 2 or 3, and you're going to go and you're going to, I think Miss Daniels is lying about statement number 2. I think that Mohammed is lying about statement number 1. And I think that because, okay, so you're going to go and vote, give your vote on which one is not true for that particular statement. We're going to have fun with that. So you're going to record your 3 statements, and whoever's talking to you is going to record their response. But they're going to say the full sentence, because we're practicing the target structure. So let's say that one of you did not agree with number 2 statement. And they say, so they're going to click the record button in the discussion area, and they're going to say, I don't believe that Miss Daniels has chased criminals across, or a criminal across a field. Okay, so let me make this easy. This should be an S, right? Okay, so you are going to post it, and you're going to say all 3. Okay, you're going to say all 3 in a recording, and then the student is going to come respond to your recording with a recording and tell you that what they don't believe. Or, I don't believe Miss Daniels has piloted a plane. I don't think she can fly a plane. She's an English teacher. Okay? So put those out in your voice recording in the discussion board. I also want you to write them and say them, and then your fellow student is just going to give you a verbal response. These instructions are going to also be in the discussion area for the week, so they'll be there again. Okay, that's, and the idea is, can you get the right pronunciation? Realized, that's just the D sound because it ends in a voice Z. Attended, well, that's an extra syllable because it ends in a D. Planned, studied, evaluated. Okay, so those have an extra syllable because they end in T or D. This one, coached. Well, that's a silent sound because ch is silent. Okay, and I'd highly recommend that you go through every single verb and practice until you are an expert. Okay, everybody, I'll see you online, and I look forward to finding out what you're lying about. Don't tell anybody, though. You'll tell everybody later. Okay, have a good week.